Hello, girls and boys. Welcome to Storytime Fun. We hope you enjoy it. Today's story is out of the Walt Disney's Storyland book. And today's story is called Pedro. Once upon a time, in a little airport near Santiago, Chile, there lived 3 little airplanes. There was a papa plane, a mama plane, and a baby plane. The papa plane was a big, powerful male plane. The mama plane was a middle-sized female plane. And the baby was a little boy plane named Pedro. Pedro's great ambition in life was to grow up to be a big plane. Like his father, he wanted to carry the mail between Chile and Argentina. So he drank his gasoline every day like a good little plane and went to ground school to learn the ABCs of flying. In the little airport schoolhouse, he studied reading, skywriting, and arithmetic, all in Spanish, of course, because he was a little South American plane. He also studied history and geography. And in geography, he learned the mail route between Santiago and Mendoza over the mountains in the Western Hemisphere, past Aconcagua, the highest mountain in the Western Hemisphere. This was the most fun because Pedro could picture himself slicing through the clouds and skimming past the mountain peaks, carrying the mail over that route. That day came sooner than he expected. One morning, the papa plane was laid up with a cold in his cylinder head, so he couldn't fly the mail. He just stayed in his hangar, sneezing and wiping his windshield. The mama plane couldn't stand the altitude because she had high oil pressure, so she couldn't fly the mail. But everyone knows the mail must go through, and there was only Pedro to take it. The papa plane and the mama plane talked it over in low whispers. And finally, they called little Pedro. "You, my son," mumbled the papa plane, "will have to carry the mail today." And he gave him a long list of instructions. And, the papa plane said sternly, "whatever you do, don't go near Aconcagua. Flight 2 leaving for Mendoza," chanted the signal tower. "That's me," grinned Pedro, and he swung into position on the runway with his propeller whirring briskly. "All clear, Pedro," called the papa plane from his hangar. "Let her go." Pedro waved a wing in the direction of his parents' hangar, then looking as stern and grown up as he could, he took off. Down the runway, Pedro hopped. "Give her the gun, boy," he heard his father's hoarse voice call behind him. Pedro took a deep breath and cleared a stone wall at the end of the runway. Ooh, that is, he almost cleared it. Yikes, a few small stones clattered to the ground as he zoomed over. "Don't lose your flying speed," he heard his father shout from the ground. And up into the air flew Pedro. The radio tower ducked as he swept past. The school bell clanged as he flew right through the tower. Yikes! But Pedro kept on. He had a hard time of it, struggling for altitude, but he put everything he had into it. After all, this was his first chance to carry the mail just as his father did. Soon, Pedro was in the mountains, looking right and left. He kept a careful distance between himself and the mountain peaks. But suddenly, oh, down fell Pedro, slipping between the jagged peaks at such terrific speed that his muffler and cap were ripped loose and floated down behind him. Ah! Pedro was caught in a dreadful downdraft. He fought against the downward pull with all his strength. At last, he managed to push his nose up and pull out. For the moment, he was safe again. Phew! Now, Pedro was heading into a range of snowy peaks. He was doing all right. In fact, Pedro felt on top of the world when, suddenly he was shattered in every cylinder. He stared ahead, open-mouthed, and dashed behind a cloud. From this hiding place, he popped his head out for another look. Sure enough, he was face to face with that towering monarch of the Andes, Aconcagua. Oh. And most frightening of all, the jagged crags of the mountainside seemed to form a huge, evil, forbidding stone face which glared fiercely at little Pedro through the clouds. Taking a deep breath, Pedro shot forward, raced behind a huge cloud, and came out on the other side of the peak, safe and sound, and pleased with himself. The worst was over now. It was clear sailing to Mendoza. Pedro came into the Mendoza airport just as he had been taught, and soon spied the mailbag on the hangar hook. It was waiting for the mail plane, and he, Pedro, was the mail plane. Almost bursting with pride, Pedro rolled over on his back and floated down toward the dangling sack. He hooked it neatly over one wing, and in another moment he was flying off again. Now the mountains loomed ahead once more, but Pedro was not disturbed. He was homeward bound and ahead of schedule. I bet my mother and dad would be proud of me, he thought. Just for practice, he did a few barrel rolls and loop-the-loops. He sailed on his back in lazy circles. He dove through the clouds. He had a wonderful time. But he forgot all about being a grown-up mail plane with a job to do. He forgot all about the mountains and his mother and father waiting beyond them. He spied a giant condor and chased the ugly bird all over the sky. Before long, Pedro lost track of the condor in a dense fog which shrouded the mountains. He was flying blindly through the fog, making brave little machine gun noises to keep its spirits up. Before him loomed Aconcagua, shrouded in low clouds. The monster face, formed by its rocky, snow-filled crags, frowned threateningly at poor Pedro. The oil froze in little Pedro's cylinders. His motor knocked with fright. All the warnings he had ever heard came back to him now. The treacherous cross currents, the sudden mountain storms. Bravely, he headed toward the peak. Now the storm broke loose with a roar of fury and fastened itself upon Pedro. The lightning lashed out at him, and the thunder roared its threats. Rain blinded him, and the wind kept shoving and buffeting him toward the mountain. Oh! Suddenly his windshield wipers shuddered, and he spun around in midair. The mountain's solid wall of rock loomed just ahead of him. Pedro hurled his weight to one side in the steep bank. One wing clipped a shower of rocks loose from the mountainside, and Pedro spun dizzily. Before he could right himself, the mailbag dropped from his wing. I really need altitude, fast, to get out of this, Pedro thought grimly. But I've got to deliver the mail. So instead of climbing to safety, the brave little plane dove through the storm after the lost mailbag. Straining his eyes through the blackness, he caught sight of the mailbag being tossed by the wind below him. Down he shot into the heart of the storm and grabbed the bag on a wing. Yay! Now I've got to climb, he told himself while the wind tossed and buffeted him. Up into the storm, Pedro climbed, snow-coated the plane, and heaped up on the mailbag. Yikes! The extra weight dragged Pedro back. More altitude, he thought. I need 25,000 feet. Pedro flashed a glance at his altimeter. It read 15,000. Oh, he tilted his nose up and flew hard. The altimeter crawled up to 20,000. Up and still up, he fought his way, shaking off the snow as the air cleared around him. Now the altimeter hand pointed to 25,000. Yay! Boy, I made it! Pedro managed a tired grin. Now all I have to do is level off and head for home. But just as he got his nose pointed safely toward the home airport, Pedro started coughing and sputtering, and he couldn't stop it. Suddenly, an awful thought flashed through Pedro's mind. He glanced at his fuel gauge. He was out of gas. And still coughing and sputtering, poor Pedro began to fall toward the mountains. Back at the home airport, Pedro's parents searched the empty skies in vain. They saw the blackness gather over the mountain peaks and knew that it meant a storm. The hours passed, but there was no sign of their little son, Pedro. From the signal tower lights combed the sky. At last they went out, and the tower slept. The Papa and Mama planes strained to see through the fog, but their eyes blinked sadly. Their brave little son was gone. Another martyr to the mail service. Poor little fellow. And on his first flight, too. Suddenly, a distant whir of sound caught their ears. They looked up hopefully. The eyes of the tower opened, and the searchlights flashed into the sky. It couldn't be. But yes, it was Pedro. Yay! He hit the runway head first and bounced along upside down. But he had made it. His parents taxied out to meet him. Pedro, Petey, oh boy, you are all right, the Mama and Papa planes cried. As the searchlight beamed on him, Pedro opened his eyes, smiled wearily. It may not have been exactly a 3-point landing, said the proud Papa plane. But he did fulfill his mission. Pedro did the most important thing. He brought the mail through. Pedro wiggled one wing, and his papa unhooked the mailbag and opened it. There was one card inside. The papa plane looked at it. Está divirtiendum, it read. Having a wonderful time. Said the papa plane. Well, it might have been important, and he did bring in the mail. Pedro nodded his sleepy head and smiled. And so the papa plane, the mama plane, and the little Pedro plane flew happily ever after. And in time, Pedro became the most famous plane ever to fly the route from Santiago to Mendoza. Well, that's it for today. We'll see you next time.